The knight's weathered hands trembled as they reached for her, centuries of loneliness crashing against the present moment like waves against stone. Julie Roberts stood before him in the flickering candlelight of his chamber, her dark hair cascading over shoulders that had known too much hardship for her 23 years. The storm outside battered the ancient castle walls, but inside this room, time seemed suspended between heartbeats. "I have not known a woman's touch since the Crusades," Alan Bennett whispered, his voice rough with emotion that had been buried for lifetimes. His eyes, still sharp despite the weight of immortal years, searched her face for any sign of fear or revulsion. Instead, he found only understanding and something deeper that made his chest tighten with forgotten hope. Julie stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. She had come to his chamber not as a servant or a conquest, but as a woman who recognized the profound isolation in his gaze. The same isolation that had lived in her own heart since losing everything she had ever loved, to the endless wars that plagued their land. "Then perhaps," she said softly, her fingers brushing against his bearded cheek, "it is time to remember what it means to be alive." The candles guttered in their holders as Alan drew her into his arms, 800 years of solitude finally breaking like a dam. Her warmth seeped through the barriers he had built around his heart, barriers that had kept him functioning through centuries of battle and loss. Julie's lips met his with a tenderness that spoke of healing rather than passion, of two souls recognizing their shared wounds. Outside, the wind howled through the battle mishap where Alan had stood guard for more nights than any mortal man could count. But in this moment, wrapped in Julie's embrace, he felt the first stirrings of something he had thought lost forever: hope. The possibility that even a cursed knight might find redemption in the arms of a woman brave enough to see past his darkness. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments. But to understand how these two broken souls found each other in the depths of a medieval winter, we must return to where their story truly began. 3 months earlier, when Julie Roberts first arrived at Raven's Hollow Castle with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter of introduction from a dead priest. The autumn rain had turned the castle courtyard into a muddy quagmire when Julie first glimpsed the towering figure of Sir Alan Bennett. She clutched her meager possessions closer to her chest as the wagon that had brought her from the destroyed village of Millhaven lurched to a stop beside the main gates. The driver, a grizzled man named Dennis Patel, barely glanced at her as he unloaded her single trunk. "This is as far as I go, girl," Dennis muttered, his eyes darting nervously toward the castle's imposing walls. "Lord William Morales expects you in the Great Hall before sunset. Best not keep him waiting." Julie nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. The letter from Father Lewis Ward, written just before the plague claimed his life, had promised her sanctuary at Raven's Hollow. But sanctuary often came with a price, especially for a young woman with no family or fortune to protect her. The castle gates groaned open, revealing a courtyard bustling with activity despite the dreary weather. Servants hurried between buildings, their heads bowed against the rain. Soldiers practiced their sword work under covered areas, their metal armor gleaming dully in the gray light. And standing apart from it all, near the base of the keep's main tower, was the knight who would change her life forever. Alan Bennett stood motionless as a statue, his dark cloak whipping around him in the wind. Even from across the courtyard, Julie could sense something different about him. While the other knights and soldiers moved with the casual confidence of mortal men, there was an otherworldly stillness to Alan's posture. His pale eyes swept the courtyard with the vigilance of someone who had seen too much and forgotten too little. Their gazes met across the muddy expanse, and Julie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Those eyes held depths that seemed to stretch back through centuries, filled with a weariness that made her own troubles feel small by comparison. For a moment, neither moved. Then a servant girl named Cynthia Sanders appeared at Julie's elbow, breaking the spell. "You must be the new girl from Millhaven," Cynthia said, her voice kind but hurried. "I'm to take you to Lord William immediately. He's been waiting." Julie tore her gaze away from the mysterious knight and followed Cynthia through the castle's maze-like corridors. The walls were thick stone, built to withstand siege warfare, and decorated with faded tapestries depicting long-ago battles. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of ancient secrets. The great hall was a cavernous space dominated by a massive fireplace and long wooden tables. Lord William Morales sat in a high-backed chair at the head table, his weathered face stern but not unkind. Beside him stood his daughter Megan Morales, a woman of perhaps 30 with intelligent eyes and prematurely gray hair. "So you are the girl Father Ward wrote about," Lord William said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Julie Roberts, daughter of the blacksmith Thomas Roberts, recently deceased of the plague." "Yes, my lord," Julie replied, dropping into a curtsy that her mother had taught her years ago. "Father Ward said you might have need of another servant in your household." Lord William studied her with the calculating gaze of a man who had survived decades of political intrigue. "The good father mentioned that you can read and write, uncommon skills for a blacksmith's daughter." "My mother was educated in a convent before she married," Julie explained. "She taught me letters and numbers before she died." "Useful skills indeed," Megan interjected, stepping forward. "We have need of someone to help manage the household accounts and correspondence. The previous girl ran off with a traveling merchant last month." Julie felt a flutter of hope. Working with accounts and letters would be far preferable to scrubbing floors or emptying chamber pots. "I would be honored to serve in whatever capacity you see fit, my lady." Lord William nodded slowly. "Very well. Megan will show you to your quarters and explain your duties. You will take your meals with the other household servants and attend chapel services daily. Any questions?" "Only one, my lord," Julie said, then hesitated. The question burning in her mind seemed foolish, but she could not shake the image of the knight in the courtyard. "The knight I saw when I arrived, the one with the dark cloak. Who is he?" A strange silence fell over the hall. Lord William and Megan exchanged a look that spoke of shared knowledge and carefully guarded secrets. When Lord William finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Julie's skin prickle. "That would be Sir Alan Bennett," he said carefully. "He has served this castle faithfully for many years. You would do well to avoid him, girl. Some men carry shadows that are best left undisturbed." The weeks that followed settled into a routine that Julie found both comforting and confining. She worked each morning in the solar with Megan, carefully copying letters and tallying accounts by the light of tall windows that looked out over the surrounding countryside. The work was precise and demanding, but Julie found satisfaction in bringing order to the chaos of numbers and correspondence that had accumulated during the previous servant's neglect. Her afternoons were spent in various household duties, helping to manage the complex logistics of feeding and housing nearly 200 people within the castle walls. She learned the names and faces of the other servants, from Jack Miller, the head groom, to Janet Reyes, the head cook. Most welcomed her with the casual friendliness of people accustomed to the constant flow of new faces in a lord's household. But always at the edges of her daily life was the presence of Sir Alan Bennett. She would catch glimpses of him during her duties. Sometimes he stood watch on the battlements, his dark figure silhouetted against the sky like a guardian spirit. Other times she would see him in the training yard, moving through sword forms with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the heavy armor he wore. His movements were precise and economical, lacking the flashy flourishes of younger knights, but possessing a deadly efficiency that spoke of countless battles. What struck Julie most was his solitude. While the other knights gathered in groups to share meals and stories, Alan remained apart. He ate alone, trained alone, and walked the castle corridors with the measured pace of a man who had grown accustomed to his own company. The other servants gave him respectful space, their deference tinged with something that might have been fear or awe. It was during her third week at Ravenshollow that Julie first heard the whispers. She was in the kitchens, helping Janet Reyes prepare the evening meal, when two serving girls began talking in low voices near the bread ovens. Julie tried to focus on her task of chopping vegetables, but their words carried clearly in the warm, herb-scented air. "My grandmother swears she saw Sir Alan when she was just a girl," one whispered. "That would make him near 80 years old. But look at him. Does he seem aged to you?" "Don't be foolish," the other replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "Men don't live that long, especially not knights who've seen as much battle as he has." "Then explain why he never seems to change," the first girl pressed. My mother worked in this castle for 30 years before she died, and she always said Sir Alan looked exactly the same from her first day to her last. Julie's knife stilled in her hand. She glanced toward the kitchen's main entrance, where she could see into the great hall beyond. Alan sat at one of the lower tables eating his evening meal with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. In the flickering torchlight, his face did indeed seem ageless, his dark hair showing no trace of gray, despite what should have been decades of warfare. There are stranger things in this world than long-lived knights, Janet Reyes said firmly. Appearing beside the gossiping girls with the authority of someone who had managed the castle kitchens for 20 years. And wise servants know better than to spread tales about their betters. Back to work, both of you. The girls scattered, but their words lingered in Julie's mind like smoke from a dying fire. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, she found herself staring at the ceiling and wondering what secrets might be hidden within Raven's Hollow's ancient walls. Her answer came sooner than expected, in the form of a midnight encounter that would change everything between her and the mysterious night. Julie had been unable to sleep, her mind churning with thoughts of home and family and the uncertain future that stretched before her. She had risen from her bed and made her way to the castle's chapel, hoping that prayer might bring the peace that had eluded her in her chamber. The chapel was a small but beautiful space, its stone walls softened by colorful tapestries depicting scenes from the lives of saints. Candles burned before the altar, their flames casting gentle light over carved wooden pews and a simple crucifix. Julie knelt in the back row and closed her eyes, seeking comfort in the familiar words of prayers her mother had taught her. She was so absorbed in her devotions that she did not hear the soft footsteps on stone until they stopped directly behind her. Julie turned, her heart racing, and found herself looking up into the pale eyes of Sir Alan Bennet. In the candlelight, his face seemed carved from marble, beautiful and terrible in its stark perfection. He wore no armor, only a simple tunic and cloak. But his presence filled the small chapel with an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "Forgive me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did not mean to disturb your prayers." "You did not disturb me, Sir Alan," Julie replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The chapel belongs to all who seek solace here." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze seeming to look through her rather than at her. "You are the new girl from Millhaven, Julie Roberts." "Yes, my lord." "Your village was destroyed by plague." It was not a question, but Julie nodded anyway. The sickness came in late summer. By autumn, there was nothing left but empty houses and graves. Alan's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or recognition of a familiar sorrow. "You have known loss. Haven't we all, my lord?" The question seemed to surprise him. For the first time since entering the chapel, his perfect composure cracked slightly. He moved to the pew beside her, not sitting but resting one hand on its worn wooden back. "Some losses cut deeper than others," he said quietly. "Some wounds never fully heal, no matter how much time passes." Julie sensed that he was speaking of something far more personal than the general tragedies of war and disease that plagued their world. She studied his profile in the candlelight, noting the way shadows pooled in the hollow of his cheeks and the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of centuries rather than decades. "How long have you served Lord William?" and she asked. "Longer than you might imagine," he replied, his voice carrying a weight of meaning that made her shiver. "The serving girls say you never seem to age." Alan turned to look at her directly, and Julie felt the full force of his attention like a physical thing. Those pale eyes seemed to strip away all pretense, seeing her not as a servant or a young woman, but as a soul laid bare. "And what do you say, Julie Roberts?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications she could not fully grasp. Julie felt as though she stood at the edge of a precipice, with truth yawning like an abyss before her. She could give him a safe answer, dismiss the servant's gossip as foolish superstition, or she could step forward into the unknown. "I say that some men carry more than their share of the world's sorrow," she said finally, "and that the weight of such burdens might well mark a soul in ways that ordinary time cannot touch." Alan stared at her for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting the chapel's candlelight like mirrors. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that made Julie's heart ache for reasons she could not name. You speak as one who has looked into darkness and chosen not to turn away. Perhaps because I have nowhere else to turn, Julie replied honestly. When you lose everything, you learn to see clearly. There is no comfort left in pretty lies. He moved then, settling onto the pew beside her with a grace that seemed to defy the solid reality of wood and stone. This close, Julie could see the fine details that set him apart from mortal men. His skin was too pale, too perfect, unmarked by the scars that should have decorated a warrior's flesh. His breathing was so shallow as to be almost imperceptible, and his eyes held depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades of accumulated memory. "What are you?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. Allen was quiet for so long that Julie began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as though each one carried the weight of long-buried secrets. "I was a knight of the realm, sworn to serve God and King in the Holy Land. That much, at least, remains true." He paused, his gaze fixed on the crucifix above the altar. "I rode with the armies of Christendom to reclaim Jerusalem from the Saracens. I fought in battles whose names are now forgotten by history, and in the end, I failed in the most fundamental way a knight can fail." "How so?" "I chose love over duty." The words came out bitter, tinged with centuries of regret. "There was a woman in Acre, a healer who tended the wounded without regard for their faith or nation. Her name was Amara, and she was beautiful beyond mortal description. When I should have been planning our next assault, I was composing poetry in her honor. When I should have been leading my men, I was stealing moments in her arms." Julie felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, which was absurd. This woman had been dead for centuries, and Julie had no claim on the knight's affections. Yet the pain in his voice when he spoke Amara's name cut through her like a blade. "What happened to her?" "She died because of my neglect," Allen said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "While I was distracted by love, our enemies breached the city walls. Amara was tending wounded soldiers in a makeshift hospital when the Saracens overran it. They showed no mercy to healers or patients alike. The chapel fell silent except for the soft crackling of candle flames." Julie could feel the weight of Allen's grief, a sorrow so profound that it seemed to press against her chest like a physical thing. "I found her body among the others," he continued. "Beautiful Amara, who had never raised a weapon against anyone, who had saved the lives of Christian and Muslim alike. She died because I had forgotten my duty, because I had allowed myself to believe that a knight could set aside his vows for the sake of love." "That wasn't your fault," Julie said firmly. "War is chaos. People die in war, regardless of how vigilant their protectors might be." Allen turned to look at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "You are kind to say so, but kindness cannot change the truth of what happened next." "What do you mean?" "I knelt beside Amar's body and swore an oath that would bind me for all eternity. I promised that I would never again allow love to distract me from my duty, that I would serve as a guardian and protector until the end of days, never taking a wife, never knowing a woman's touch, never again risking another's life for the sake of my own desires." Julie felt her blood turn cold as the implications of his words sank in. An oath of celibacy. "More than that," Allen said grimly. "I called upon God himself to witness my vow, to bind me to it with chains stronger than death itself. And Almo, in his infinite wisdom or perhaps his infinite cruelty, granted my request." "You mean—" "I mean that I have walked this earth for 800 years, Julie Roberts. I have served kings whose names are carved on forgotten tombstones. I have fought in wars that exist now only in dusty chronicles. I have watched empires rise and fall, seen plagues sweep across continents, witnessed the birth and death of countless generations. And through it all, I have honored my oath. I have never again known a woman's touch." The weight of his revelations settled over Julie like a heavy cloak. She stared at this man who was not a man, this knight who had been cursed by his own nobility to walk through centuries alone. The loneliness she had sensed in him now made perfect sense, as did the otherworldly stillness that set him apart from mortal men. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Allen was quiet for a moment, his gaze returning to the altar. "Because for the first time in 8 centuries, I find myself questioning whether the price of my oath might be too high to bear. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Julie felt her heart racing, her mind reeling with the implications of what he had revealed. This immortal knight, bound by divine vow to eternal solitude, was suggesting that her presence had somehow shaken the foundations of his carefully constructed existence. "Sir Alan," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Say nothing more tonight," he said, rising from the pew with fluid grace. "I have already spoken more than I should. Forget my words, Julie Roberts. For both our sakes, forget everything I have told you." He turned and walked toward the chapel's entrance, his footsteps silent on the stone floor. At the doorway, he paused without turning back. "But know this," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sacred space. "If circumstances were different, if I were free to choose my own path, there is no woman in all the world I would rather have beside me than you." Then he was gone, leaving Julie alone with the flickering candles and the echo of words that would haunt her dreams for nights to come. The days that followed Alan's revelation passed in a haze of confused emotions and stolen glances. Julie threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, helping Megan manage the increasingly complex preparations for the approaching winter season. Supply wagons needed to be inventoried, stores of grain and preserved meat carefully cataloged, and arrangements made for the additional soldiers who would shelter at Ravenshollow during the harsh months ahead. But even as her hands stayed busy with practical concerns, Julie's mind remained fixed on the impossible knight who had shared his deepest secret with her in the quiet sanctuary of the chapel. She found herself watching for him throughout her daily routine, her pulse quickening whenever she caught sight of his dark cloak or heard his distinctive footsteps in the corridor. Alan, for his part, seemed determined to maintain the distance he had counseled in their final exchange. He appeared at meals and training sessions as always, but he no longer met her eyes when their paths crossed. The careful politeness with which he acknowledged her presence was somehow more painful than outright avoidance would have been. It was Cynthia Sanders who finally forced Julie to confront the growing tension that threatened to consume her thoughts entirely. "You're mooning over Sir Alan like a lovesick maiden," Cynthia said bluntly one afternoon as they worked together in the castle's herb garden, gathering the last hardy plants before the first hard frost. "Everyone can see it, including him." Julie's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she tried to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you don't," Cynthia replied with a knowing smile. "Just like you don't sigh whenever he walks past, or find excuses to work near the windows that overlook the training yard when he's practicing with his sword." "He's an interesting man," Julie said carefully. "There's no harm in observation." "Interesting is one word for him," Cynthia agreed. "Dangerous might be another. Cursed, perhaps, if you believe the old stories." Julie's hands stilled among the sage leaves she had been gathering. "What old stories?" Cynthia glanced around the garden to ensure they were alone, then leaned closer. "My mother worked in this castle before me, and her mother before that. The women in my family have been serving the lords of Ravenshollow for 3 generations. We remember things that others prefer to forget." "What kind of things?" "Like the fact that Sir Alan Bennett has been here since my great-grandmother's time, looking exactly as he does today. Like the way he never seems to eat much food, though he maintains the strength of 10 men. Like how he can walk through the castle at night without making a sound, as though his feet barely touch the ground." Julie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Those could all have natural explanations. "Could they?" Cynthia asked. "What about the way animals react to him? Have you noticed how horses grow calm in his presence? How even the most vicious war dogs become docile when he approaches? Or how he seems to know things about people that he has no way of knowing?" "I'm not sure what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting that Sir Alan Bennett is not entirely human," Cynthia said bluntly. "And I'm warning you, as one woman to another, that getting involved with such a creature can only end in heartbreak." Julie wanted to defend Alan, to explain that he was not a creature, but a man bound by an impossible oath. But she could not reveal his secrets without betraying his trust. So she remained silent and let Cynthia's warnings wash over her like cold water. That evening, as Julie made her way to the great hall for the evening meal, she was surprised to find Alan waiting for her in one of the corridor's shadowed alcoves. He stepped out as she approached, his pale eyes reflecting the torchlight like a wolf's. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Julie's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "About what, Sir Alan?" "About the way you've been watching me, about the questions you've been asking, about the danger you're placing yourself in by drawing attention to our connection." "I haven't been asking questions," Julie protested. "Haven't you?" Alan stepped closer, his presence seeming to fill the narrow corridor. "Cynthia Sanders came to me this afternoon with concerns about your interest in local folklore. She's worried that you're developing an unhealthy fascination with castle legends." Julie felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. Cynthia had no right to interfere. "She had every right to protect a friend from making a dangerous mistake," Alan replied firmly, "just as I have every right to protect you from the consequences of my own weakness." "Your weakness?" "In telling you the truth about my nature," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "In allowing you to see past the careful facade I've maintained for centuries. In permitting myself to care what happens to you." The last admission hung between them like a confession. Julie felt her anger dissolve, replaced by a tenderness that made her chest ache. "Alan Hoyle," she said softly, using his name without the formal title for the first time. "No," he said sharply, stepping back as though her voice had burned him. "You cannot say my name like that. You cannot look at me with such understanding in your eyes. You cannot make me remember what it feels like to be seen as a man rather than a legend." "But that's exactly what you are," Julie insisted, moving closer despite his retreat. "You're not a legend or a creature or a curse. You're a man who made a noble sacrifice and has been paying the price for it ever since." "A price that grows heavier with each passing day," Alan admitted, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Do you know what it's like, Julie, to walk through centuries without ever feeling truly alive? To watch the world change around you while you remain frozen in a single moment of grief and regret? Then stop," she said simply. "Choose to live again." Alan stared at her as though she had suggested he sprout wings and fly. "You don't understand the nature of divine oaths. They cannot be simply set aside because one grows weary of their burden." "Can't they?" Julie challenged. "Or have you simply been too afraid to test the boundaries of your prison?" The question struck him like a physical blow. For a moment, his immortal composure shattered completely, revealing the lonely man beneath the legendary night. Julie saw centuries of accumulated pain in his eyes, along with something that might have been hope struggling to break free from the weight of despair. "Even if it were possible," he said finally, "even if I could find a way to break free from my oath, what then? I am not truly alive, Julie. I am sustained by divine will rather than mortal flesh. What could I offer a woman like you except the shadow of what a real man might provide?" "You could offer yourself," she replied without hesitation. "Your strength, your wisdom, your capacity for love. Those things aren't shadows, Alan. They're real and they're enough." He reached out then, his hand stopping just short of touching her face. In the torchlight, Julie could see the war being fought behind his eyes, duty battling desire, centuries of careful control struggling against the pull of genuine connection. "If I were to touch you now," he whispered, "if I were to give in to what I feel growing between us, there would be no going back. The oath that has sustained me for 8 centuries would be broken, and I do not know what the consequences might be." "Then don't touch me," Julie said, though every fiber of her being longed for his contact. "Not yet, not until you're certain that the risk is worth taking." Alan's hand fell to his side, but his eyes remained fixed on her face. "And if I decide that it is? If I choose to gamble my immortal existence on the chance that love might prove stronger than divine judgment?" "Then I'll be waiting," Julie promised. "However long it takes for you to make that choice." Winter descended upon Raven's Hollow with unusual ferocity, bringing blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures cold enough to freeze wine solid in its casks. The castle's inhabitants drew closer together, both literally and figuratively, as they waited for spring's eventual return. Additional soldiers had arrived as planned, along with refugees from villages that had been abandoned to the harsh weather, swelling the castle's population to nearly 300 souls. Julie found herself busier than ever, helping to manage the complex logistics of feeding and housing so many people through the lean months. Her skill with numbers and letters had made her indispensable to Megan's household management, and she often worked late into the evening by candlelight, updating inventories and calculating rations. It was during one of these late-night work sessions that Alan appeared in the Solar's doorway like a ghost materializing from shadow. Julie looked up from her ledgers to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You shouldn't be working so late," he said, stepping into the room without invitation. "The candles are expensive, and you'll ruin your eyes straining to see by such poor light." "The work needs to be done," Julie replied, though she set down her quill and rubbed her tired eyes. "With so many extra mouths to feed, every grain of wheat and barrel of ale must be accounted for." Alan moved closer, his footsteps silent on the stone floor. "You've lost weight since winter began. You are working yourself too hard." The observation was accurate but unexpected. Julie had been so focused on her duties that she had barely noticed her own declining appetite or the way her clothes had begun to hang loose on her frame. That Alan had noticed such details about her appearance made her heart flutter with a mixture of pleasure and nervousness. "I eat enough," she said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "When was the last time you had a full meal? Not scraps grabbed between tasks, but an actual meal eaten at leisure?" Julie couldn't remember, which was answer enough. Alan shook his head with what might have been exasperation or concern. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand toward her. "Where?" "To the kitchens. Janet always keeps soup warming over the fire for the night guards. You're going to eat a proper meal, even if I have to watch you consume every spoonful." The idea of sharing a meal with Alan, even something as simple as soup in the castle kitchens, sent a thrill of anticipation through Julie's tired body. She rose from her chair, careful not to take his offered hand despite the temptation. "That's not necessary, Sir Alan. I can take care of myself." "Can you?" he asked, his pale eyes searching her face. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're slowly disappearing. And I find that I cannot bear the thought of losing you to something as mundane as neglect." The admission was spoken so quietly that Julie almost missed it, but the words hit her like a physical blow, revealing just how much their strange relationship had come to mean to him. She saw the vulnerability in his expression, the fear that he was allowing himself to care too much for someone whose mortal life could end at any moment. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "I promise." "Promises are fragile things," Alan replied. "I learned that lesson 8 centuries ago, when I promised Amara that I would always protect her." "I'm not Amara," Julie said firmly, "and this isn't the Holy Land. The dangers here are different, and so are the choices we can make." Alan studied her for a long moment, his immortal composure wavering like candlelight in a draught. "You make it sound so simple." "Maybe it is," Julie suggested. "Maybe we've been making it more complicated than it needs to be. And maybe you don't understand the forces we're dealing with," Alan countered. "Divine oaths aren't broken lightly, Julie. The consequences could be catastrophic." "Or they could be liberating," she replied. "You won't know until you try to." Alan was quiet for several heartbeats, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that made Julie's breath catch in her throat. "Come with me to the kitchens," he said again. "Let me watch you eat a proper meal. Let me pretend, for just one evening, that I am a normal man caring for a woman who matters to him." The request was so simple and yet so loaded with meaning that Julie felt tears prick at her eyes. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The castle's kitchens were warm and dimly lit, the massive hearth providing both light and heat against the winter cold. Janet Reyes had indeed left a pot of soup simmering over the coals, along with fresh bread wrapped in clean cloth. Alan ladled soup into a wooden bowl while Julie cut thick slices of the still warm bread. They sat together at the long wooden table where the kitchen staff took their meals, the space feeling intimate despite its size. Julie was acutely aware of Alan's presence beside her, the way he watched her eat, with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every detail. "Tell me about your life before Raven's Hollow," he said as she worked her way through the hearty vegetable soup. "There isn't much to tell," Julie replied. "My father was the village blacksmith. My mother helped with the forage work and raised me to be useful. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough. The plague changed everything." "You must miss them." "Every day," Julie admitted. "But grief is like winter. It's harsh and painful, but it eventually gives way to spring. Alan was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight. I envy your certainty. After 8 centuries, I'm not sure I remember what spring feels like. Then maybe it's time to find out, Julie said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. The contact was electric, sending shock waves through both of them. Alan stared down at their joined hands as though he had never seen such a thing before. His skin was warm despite his otherworldly nature, his fingers long and elegant beneath her smaller ones. Julie, he whispered, her name carrying the weight of centuries of loneliness. I know, she replied, understanding without words the magnitude of what was happening between them. Alan turned his hand palm up, intertwining their fingers with infinite care. I have not held a woman's hand since the Crusades, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I had forgotten how such simple contact could feel like coming home. They sat in the warm kitchen, hands joined across the wooden table, while the fire crackled in the hearth and snow fell steadily outside the shuttered windows. For the first time in months, Julie felt truly at peace. And for the first time in centuries, Alan allowed himself to believe that redemption might be possible. But their moment of quiet connection was shattered by the sound of running footsteps in the corridor outside. Jack Miller burst into the kitchen, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. Sir Alan, he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. You must come quickly. There are riders approaching the castle, and they're flying Lord William's banner upside down. Alan was on his feet instantly, his warrior instincts overriding everything else. How many riders? Perhaps a dozen, Jack replied. They're pushing their horses hard despite the snow. Whatever news they bring, it cannot be good. Alan turned to Julie, his expression grim. Go to your quarters and stay there until morning. Lock your door and don't open it for anyone except Meghan or Lord William himself. What's happening? Julie asked, rising from her chair with growing alarm. I don't know yet, Alan replied, already moving toward the kitchen's entrance. But riders who travel through a blizzard with distress signals rarely bring word of anything good. He paused at the doorway, looking back at her with eyes that held both regret and determination. Whatever happens, remember what we shared here tonight. Remember that for one perfect moment, an immortal knight allowed himself to feel human again. Then he was gone, leaving Julie alone with Jack Miller in the echo of words that sounded disturbingly like a farewell. Julie tried to follow Alan's instructions, but sleep proved impossible as the sounds of urgent activity echoed through the castle corridors. She could hear boots on stone, voices raised in discussion, and the general commotion that accompanied unexpected arrivals in the middle of a winter night. After an hour of restless pacing in her small chamber, she gave up any pretense of rest and made her way quietly toward the great hall. The scene that greeted her was one of controlled chaos. Lord William sat in his high chair, while Meghan stood beside him, both listening intently to a mud-splattered messenger who gestured emphatically as he spoke. Alan stood with the other knights near the great hearth, his face grim in the firelight. Servants moved through the hall carrying food and drink for the exhausted riders, while stable boys tended to their lathered horse in the courtyard beyond. Julie positioned herself in the shadows near the hall's entrance, close enough to hear the conversation, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention to her presence. The situation is worse than we feared, the messenger was saying, his voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. King Edward's forces have been routed at Stirling Bridge. The Scots under William Wallace have taken control of most of the lowlands, and they're moving south with a force of nearly 10,000 men. Lord William's face remained impassive, but Julie could see the tension in his shoulders. How far south? They crossed the Tweed 3 days ago, the messenger replied. At their current pace, they'll reach the northern borders of your lands within the week. A murmur ran through the assembled knights and nobles. The Scottish army's rapid advance was clearly unexpected, and the implications were sobering. Ravenshollow Castle sat squarely in the path of any Scottish force moving deeper into English territory. What are the king's orders? Meghan asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. All northern lords are commanded to prepare for siege, the messenger replied. The king is gathering a new army, but it will take time to assemble sufficient forces to meet the Scottish threat. Until then, you are to hold your positions and deny the enemy any easy victories. Alan stepped forward from the group of knights. What intelligence do we have about Wallace's intentions? Is he planning to consolidate his gains in the north, or does he mean to push deeper into England? Intelligence suggests he intends to strike as far south as York, the messenger replied. He means to demonstrate that Scottish forces can penetrate deep into English territory with impunity. Success here would likely bring more Scottish clans to his banner. Then he cannot be allowed to succeed, Lord William declared, rising from his chair with the authority of a man who had spent decades defending the northern marches. We will prepare for siege immediately. Double the watch, secure the outer defenses, and begin rationing supplies to ensure we can withstand a prolonged assault. The hall erupted into organized activity as knights and servants dispersed to carry out their assigned tasks. Julie pressed herself further into the shadows as people streamed past her, but her hiding place was discovered when Alan appeared at her elbow with the silent grace that characterized all his movements. "I told you to stay in your quarters," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of reproach. "I couldn't sleep," Julie replied. The sounds of activity were too disturbing. Alan studied her face in the dim light, his pale eyes reflecting both concern and something deeper. "You heard the messenger's report." "Enough of it," Julie admitted. "We're going to be besieged, aren't we?" "Almost certainly," Alan confirmed. "Wallace is too good a commander to bypass a fortified position like Ravenshollow. He'll want to eliminate any threat to his supply lines before moving deeper into England." The matter-of-fact way he discussed the approaching battle made Julie's blood run cold. She had lived through plague and famine, but she had never experienced the terror of siege warfare. The thought of Scottish soldiers surrounding the castle, cutting off all hope of escape or rescue, filled her with a dread that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "How long do we have?" she asked. "A few days at most," Alan replied. "Long enough to complete our preparations, but not long enough to receive reinforcements from the south." "And how long might a siege last?" Alan was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much truth she could handle. "That depends on many factors. Our supplies, their determination, the weather, the arrival of relief forces. It could be weeks, or it could be months." Julie felt the walls of the great hall pressing in around her like the sides of a tomb. The idea of being trapped within the castle for months, constantly under threat of death or capture, was almost too terrible to contemplate. "I can see the fear in your eyes," Alan said softly. "It's natural to be afraid. Only fools feel no terror at the prospect of battle." "Are you afraid?" Julie asked. Alan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I fear for others more than for myself," he said finally. "Death holds no terror for one who has already lived far longer than any mortal man should. But the thought of failing in my duty, of allowing harm to come to those under my protection, that fear never lessens regardless of how many centuries pass." Julie understood that his protection included her, and the knowledge brought both comfort and additional worry. She did not want to be the cause of any distraction that might compromise his effectiveness as a warrior. "What can I do to help?" she asked. "Stay safe," Alan replied immediately. "Help Megan with the household preparations, but don't take any unnecessary risks. Promise me that if the walls are breached, you'll go to the keep's highest tower and bar the door behind you. And wait for rescue that might never come." "Wait for me," he said. "See," he said, his voice carrying a weight of meaning that made her heart skip. "No matter what happens, no matter how dark things become, I will come for you. That is my promise." The vow was spoken with such intensity that Julie felt it settle into her bones like an unbreakable chain. She looked into his pale eyes and saw not just the immortal knight, but the man who had shared soup with her in the kitchen, who had held her hand across a wooden table, who had allowed her to see past his carefully constructed defenses. "Alan," she began, but he shook his head. "Don't say anything more," he said. "Not now, when we don't know what tomorrow might bring. But know that these past months, getting to know you, watching you bring order and purpose to this place, it has been worth 8 centuries of waiting." Before Julie could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the shadows with her racing heart and the echo of words that sounded like both a declaration of love and a final farewell. The next few days passed in a blur of frantic preparation. The castle's outer defenses were strengthened, additional supplies were moved into the keep, and every able-bodied person was assigned tasks related to the coming siege. Julie worked alongside Megan to organize the storage of food and medical supplies, while also helping to prepare sleeping areas for the refugees who continued to arrive seeking sanctuary. Through it all, she was acutely aware of Alan's presence throughout the castle. She would catch glimpses of him on the battlements, inspecting defenses and positioning archers. She saw him in the armory, checking weapons and armor with meticulous care. She watched him in the training yard, drilling younger knights in the tactics they would need to survive the coming battle. But they had no opportunity for private conversation, no chance to build upon the connection that had been forged in the kitchen that night. The approaching siege had transformed Alan back into the legendary knight, focused entirely on his duty to protect the castle and its inhabitants. It was on the fourth day after the messenger's arrival that the Scottish army finally appeared on the horizon, their banners visible from the castle's highest towers, like storm clouds gathering on the edge of the world. The sight of the Scottish army spread across the landscape like a dark stain was both magnificent and terrifying. From her position on the castle's ramparts, Julie could see thousands of warriors arranged in disciplined formations, their weapons glinting in the pale winter sunlight. Banners bearing the arms of various Scottish clans fluttered in the cold wind, while siege engines were being assembled with the methodical efficiency of experienced campaigners. "They're more organized than I expected," Megan said quietly, standing beside Julie as they watched the enemy preparations. "This isn't a raiding party or a group of undisciplined rebels. This is a real army." Julie nodded, her throat too tight with fear to trust her voice. The sheer scale of the force arrayed against them made Hollow's defenses seem pitifully inadequate. Even with the castle's thick walls and elevated position, they were outnumbered by at least 20 to 1. "Sir Alan says we can hold out until spring," Megan continued, though her voice lacked conviction. "He believes King Edward will send relief forces once the weather improves." "Do you believe that?" Julie asked. Megan was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the enemy encampment. "I believe Sir Alan will do everything in his power to keep us safe," she said finally. "Beyond that, we must trust in God's will." As if summoned by their conversation, Alan appeared on the ramparts beside them. He had donned his full armor for the first time since Julie had known him, and the transformation was startling. Gone was the solitary figure she had come to care for, replaced by a knight who seemed carved from steel and shadow. His pale eyes swept the Scottish positions with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. "They'll begin the siege in earnest tomorrow," he said without preamble. "Tonight they'll rest and complete their preparations. By dawn, we'll be under constant assault." "How long can we hold?" Megan asked. "Longer than they expect," Alan replied with grim confidence. "Raven's Hollow has never fallen to siege, and I don't intend to let that record be broken now." Julie studied his profile as he spoke, noting the way his jaw was set with determination and his hands rested easily on the pommel of his sword. This was Alan in his element, the immortal warrior who had survived 8 centuries of conflict. Yet beneath the martial confidence, she could sense the weight of responsibility he carried for every soul within the castle walls. "What do you need us to do?" Julie asked. Alan turned to look at her directly for the first time in days, and she saw a flicker of the man who had held her hand in the kitchen. "Keep the household running," he said. "Maintain morale among the servants and refugees. Make sure the wounded are properly tended. Leave the fighting to those of us who were born for it." "And if the walls are breached?" "They won't be," Alan said with absolute certainty, "not while I draw breath." The vow was spoken with such conviction that Julie almost believed it. But she had seen the size of the Scottish army, had watched their efficient preparations for siege warfare. No single knight, no matter how skilled or determined, could hold back such overwhelming numbers indefinitely. As if reading her thoughts, Alan stepped closer and lowered his voice so that only she could hear. "Whatever happens in the days to come, remember that some oaths are stronger than death itself. I made you a promise, Julie Roberts, and I intend to keep it." Before she could respond, he turned and strode away to continue his preparations. Julie watched him go, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the man she had grown to love was about to face impossible odds for the sake of duty and honor. The siege began at dawn with a thunderous barrage from the Scottish catapults. Massive stones crashed against Raven's Hollow's walls, sending showers of debris raining down into the courtyard. The defenders responded with their own artillery and volleys of arrows from the ramparts, but their smaller numbers made every shot precious. Julie spent the first day helping to tend the wounded in the castle's makeshift infirmary, located in the Great Hall for easier access. The injuries were brutal, ranging from crushed limbs caused by falling stones to arrow wounds that required immediate attention. She worked alongside Janet Reyes and several other women, doing what she could to ease suffering and preserve life. But it was impossible to ignore the sounds of battle raging just beyond the walls. The constant crash of catapult stones, the shouts of commanders, the screams of wounded men, all combined to create a symphony of violence that penetrated every corner of the castle. On the second day, the Scots attempted their first major assault on the walls. Julie watched from a high window as hundreds of warriors charged across the open ground, carrying scaling ladders and grappling hooks. The defenders met them with boiling oil, arrows, and stones dropped from the ramparts. But still the attackers came in seemingly endless waves. It was during this assault that Julie first witnessed Alan's true nature as an immortal warrior. She saw him moving along the wall like a force of nature, his sword cutting down any Scot who managed to reach the ramparts. He seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing wherever the defense was weakest, his presence alone enough to rally the defenders and push back the assault. But even Alan's superhuman abilities could not be everywhere simultaneously. By the end of the second day, several sections of the wall had been damaged, and the casualty count among the defenders was mounting steadily. The third day brought a new horror: fire arrows launched at the castle's wooden buildings. The Scots had learned from their previous failures and were now targeting the infrastructure that kept the defenders supplied and sheltered. Julie joined the bucket brigades that fought to contain the blazes, her hands blistered and her lungs burning from smoke inhalation. It was while fighting one of these fires that disaster struck. A section of burning timber collapsed without warning, trapping Cynthia Sanders beneath its weight. Julie rushed forward without thinking, grabbing one end of the beam and straining to lift it enough for Cynthia to escape. The timber was heavier than she had anticipated, and the flames licked at her arms and face as she struggled to maintain her grip. Just when her strength was about to give out, strong hands appeared beside hers, and together they lifted the burning beam high enough for other servants to drag Cynthia to safety. Julie looked up to find Alan beside her, his armor blackened with soot and his pale eyes reflecting the firelight. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands moving over her arms to check for burns. "I'm fine," Julie gasped, though her voice was rough from smoke inhalation. Cynthia was trapped. "She's safe now," Alan assured her. "But you shouldn't have taken such a risk. If you had been seriously injured—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Julie could see the fear in his eyes. The immortal knight who faced armies without flinching was terrified at the thought of losing her to something as mundane as a house fire. "I couldn't just watch her die," Julie said. "I know," Alan replied, his voice soft despite the chaos surrounding them. "Your courage is one of the things He stopped himself, glancing around at the other people fighting the fire. "One of the things that makes you valuable to this household." But Julie heard what he had almost said, and the knowledge that he loved her sent warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with the flames they had just escaped. The moment was broken by a shout from one of the wall guards. "Sir Alan, the Scots are massing for another assault." Alan's expression hardened back into the mask of the professional warrior. "Get to the infirmary," he told Julie. "Stay there until this is over." "Alan," she called as he turned to leave. He looked back, and for just an instant, his careful control slipped enough to reveal the depth of his feelings. "I know," he said simply. "I know." Then he was gone, racing toward the walls to meet the next wave of attackers. Julie watched him disappear into the smoke and chaos, her heart breaking with the knowledge that each assault might be the one that finally overwhelmed even his immortal strength. The fourth day of the siege brought a development that changed everything. Julie was in the infirmary, helping to bandage a soldier's arrow wound, when Jack Miller burst through the doors with news that sent a chill through everyone present. "The Scots have brought up a great ram," he announced breathlessly. "It's massive, bigger than anything we've seen before. They're positioning it to assault the main gate. Julie felt her blood turn cold. The main gate was the castle's most vulnerable point, and if it fell, the Scottish army would pour into the courtyard like a flood. She abandoned her patient to another woman and made her way quickly to the ramparts, where she could see the terrible machine being maneuvered into position. The battering ram was indeed enormous, easily the length of 3 men and carved from a single massive tree trunk. It was mounted on wheels and protected by a wooden roof that would shield the operators from arrows and boiling oil. Dozens of Scottish warriors surrounded it, ready to begin the methodical destruction of Ravenshallow's primary defense. "Can the gate withstand it?" Megan asked, appearing beside Julie with her face pale but determined. "For a while," Alan replied, though his voice carried no optimism. "But not indefinitely. That ram was designed specifically to break through fortified gates." "Then what do we do?" Alan was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes studying the Scottish preparations with the intensity of a man calculating impossible odds. "We make them pay for every inch," he said finally, "and we prepare for the possibility that the gate might not hold." The first blow from the great ram struck the main gate with a sound like thunder. The massive wooden doors, reinforced with iron bands and blessed by priests, shuddered under the impact but held firm. The second blow came moments later, accompanied by the rhythmic chanting of the Scottish warriors who operated the deadly machine. Julie lost count of how many times the ram struck the gate. Each impact seemed to shake the entire castle, sending tremors through the stone walls and rattling the windows in their frames. Between the thunderous blows, she could hear Alan shouting orders to the defenders, his voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of centuries of command experience. By midday, cracks had appeared in the gate's wooden planks. By evening, entire sections were splintering with each impact. The defenders had done what they could, dropping stones and fire on the ram's protective housing, but the Scottish engineers had built their machine well. Nothing seemed capable of stopping its relentless assault. It was near midnight when the gate finally gave way. The sound was unlike anything Julie had ever heard, a combination of splintering wood, screaming metal, and the triumphant roar of thousands of Scottish voices. She watched from the ramparts as enemy warriors poured through the breach like water through a broken dam, their weapons glinting in the light of torches and burning buildings. The courtyard became a scene from hell as Scottish soldiers clashed with the castle's defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Julie could see Alan in the thick of the fighting, his sword moving with deadly precision as he cut down enemy after enemy. But even his superhuman abilities were being overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers flooding through the broken gate. "We have to fall back to the keep," Megan said, grabbing Julie's arm. "The courtyard is lost." Julie wanted to protest, wanted to stay where she could see Alan fighting for their lives in the chaos below. But she knew Megan was right. The outer defenses had fallen, and their only hope now lay in the keep's thick walls and elevated position. The retreat to the keep was a nightmare of running figures, screaming voices, and the constant threat of Scottish soldiers who had broken through the defensive lines. Julie helped carry wounded defenders up the narrow stairs, her heart pounding with terror and exertion. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew ever closer as more Scottish warriors poured into the castle. The keep's great hall had been transformed into a final defensive position, with furniture piled against windows and armed men positioned at every entrance. Lord William stood in the center of the room, his sword drawn and his face grim with the knowledge that they were making their last stand. "How many made it inside?" he asked as the survivors gathered around him. "Perhaps 60 able-bodied fighters," one of the knights replied. "The rest are wounded or dead." "And the Scots?" "Hundreds, my lord. They control the entire outer castle." Julie looked around the great hall, counting the faces of those who had survived the retreat. Servants, soldiers, refugees, all crowded together in the space that had once seemed so grand and spacious. Now it felt like a tomb, their final resting place before the Scottish army completed its conquest. "Where is Sir Alan?" she asked, suddenly realizing that she hadn't seen him since the retreat began. "Still fighting in the courtyard," Jack Miller replied. "He was covering our withdrawal when I last saw him." Julie felt her heart stop. The idea that Alan might be trapped outside, surrounded by enemies, and cut off from any hope of rescue was too terrible to contemplate. She moved toward one of the hall's windows, desperate for any glimpse of the courtyard below. What she saw made her blood freeze. The courtyard was filled with Scottish warriors, their torches casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, both Scottish and English, testament to the fierce fighting that had taken place. But nowhere could she see any sign of Alan's distinctive armor or dark cloak. "He's not there," she whispered, pressing her face against the cold glass. "I can't see him anywhere." "Sir Alan is resourceful," Megan said, though her voice lacked conviction. "If anyone can survive what's happening down there, it would be him." But Julie could hear the doubt in her words, could see the fear in the faces of the other defenders. They all knew that even an immortal knight could be overwhelmed by sufficient numbers, and the Scottish army had numbers to spare. The first assault on the keep came an hour before dawn. Scottish warriors charged up the narrow stairs leading to the main entrance, only to be met by a hail of arrows from the defenders positioned at the windows. The attack was repulsed, but Julie could see that it had been more of a probing action than a serious attempt to breach their defenses. "They're testing our strength," Lord William observed, "learning where we've positioned our archers and how many men we have left." "What happens when they're ready to make a real assault?" Julie asked. Lord William's expression was grim. "Then we'll discover whether dying with honor is sufficient consolation for defeat." The words sent a chill through the assembled defenders. Julie looked around the hall at the faces of people she had come to know over the past months, realizing that many of them would likely be dead before the sun set again. The thought was almost too terrible to bear. It was then that she heard it, a sound that cut through the noise of Scottish preparations like a blade through silk, the sound of a single man's voice, raised in challenge, echoing from the courtyard below. "I am Sir Alan Bennet, Knight of Ravenshollow, sworn protector of this castle, and all who shelter within its walls. I challenge William Wallace himself to single combat, victor to determine the fate of all who remain." Julie rushed to the window, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. There, standing alone in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by hundreds of enemy warriors, was Alan. His armor was battered and blood-stained, his cloak torn and singed, but he stood with the proud bearing of a knight who had never known defeat. The Scottish army had fallen silent at his challenge, clearly uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected development. Single combat between champions was an ancient tradition, one that carried weight even in the brutal realities of siege warfare. And then, from somewhere in the ranks of Scottish warriors, came an answering voice that would determine the fate of everyone Julie had come to love. William Wallace stepped forward from the ranks of his army, and Julie understood immediately why this man had become a legend among his people. He was tall and powerfully built, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even in a crowd of hardened warriors. His red hair caught the torchlight, and his blue eyes held the fierce intelligence that had made him such a formidable opponent to English forces. "Sir Alan Bennet," Wallace said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I have heard tales of your prowess in battle. They say you have never been defeated in single combat." "The tales speak truth," Alan replied, his sword held casually at his side despite being surrounded by enemies. "Just as they speak truth about your own skill with a blade. Shall we test which legend proves stronger?" Wallace smiled, and there was genuine respect in his expression. A knight who would stand alone against an army to protect those he serves deserves an honorable death. "I accept your challenge, Sir Alan, with the understanding that victory grants the winner the right to determine the fate of all within this castle." "Agreed, Asnahaid," Alan said without hesitation. Julie gripped the window frame so tightly that her knuckles went white. She understood the magnitude of what Alan was attempting. By accepting single combat, he was gambling everything on his own immortal abilities. If he won, the Scottish army would withdraw and the siege would end. If he lost, everyone in the keep would be at Wallace's mercy. The two champions moved to the center of the courtyard while the Scottish warriors formed a wide circle around them. Torches were brought forward to provide better light, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Julie could see Alan checking his sword and adjusting his grip, preparing for what might be the most important battle of his immortal existence. "He can win this," Megan said quietly, appearing beside Julie at the window. Sir Alan has never been defeated. His skill is beyond mortal understanding. But Wallace isn't just any opponent, Julie replied, her voice tight with anxiety. He didn't become the leader of the Scottish resistance by losing fights. Below in the courtyard, the two men began to circle each other with the careful steps of experienced killers. Wallace carried a great two-handed sword that gleamed in the torchlight, while Alan wielded his familiar blade with the easy confidence of centuries of practice. The first clash came without warning, steel ringing against steel in a shower of sparks. Both men moved with deadly grace, their weapons cutting complex patterns in the air as they tested each other's defenses. Wallace's strength was immediately apparent, his heavy blade moving with surprising speed for such a large weapon. But Alan's technique was flawless, his immortal reflexes allowing him to counter every attack with precise efficiency. The battle raged back and forth across the courtyard, neither man able to gain a decisive advantage. Wallace's raw power was matched by Alan's supernatural skill, creating a contest that seemed to exist outside the normal bounds of mortal combat. Julie watched with her heart in her throat as the two legends pushed each other to the very limits of their abilities. "How long can this continue?" she whispered. "Until one of them makes a mistake," Lord William replied grimly. He had joined them at the window, his face reflecting the same tension that gripped everyone watching the desperate combat below. As if in response to his words, Wallace suddenly changed tactics, abandoning his careful technique in favor of a berserker's fury. His great sword became a whirlwind of destruction, forcing Alan to give ground as he struggled to defend against the relentless assault. Julie could see that the Scottish champion was gambling everything on overwhelming his opponent through sheer aggression. For a terrifying moment, and it seemed as though the strategy might succeed. Alan was forced back against the courtyard wall, his defensive movements becoming increasingly desperate as Wallace's blade came closer and closer to finding its mark. The watching Scottish warriors began to cheer, sensing that their leader was on the verge of victory. But then Alan did something that reminded everyone present why he had survived 8 centuries of warfare. Instead of continuing to retreat, he suddenly stepped forward into Wallace's attack, accepting a glancing blow to his shoulder in exchange for an opening to strike at his opponent's exposed flank. The counterattack was lightning fast and perfectly executed, Alan's blade sliding between the plates of Wallace's armor to find the vulnerable flesh beneath. The Scottish champion stumbled, blood flowing from the wound, but he managed to stay on his feet and resume his defensive stance. "First blood to Sir Alan," someone murmured in the keep's great hall. But Julie could see that the wound, while serious, was not immediately fatal. Wallace was hurt but still dangerous, and the sight of his own blood seemed to have focused his fury into something even more deadly than before. The second phase of the battle was more cautious, both men now aware of their opponent's true capabilities. They circled each other like wolves, looking for any sign of weakness or opportunity. Wallace's wound was bleeding steadily, but his strength seemed undiminished. Alan's armor had been dented and scored by the earlier exchange, but his movements remained fluid and precise. It was then that Julie noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. Alan's left arm was hanging slightly lower than it should have been, suggesting that Wallace's earlier blow had done more damage than was immediately apparent. The Scottish champion had noticed it too, and was beginning to concentrate his attacks on that side. "He's hurt," Julie whispered, her voice barely audible. "All warriors get hurt," Megan replied, but her voice carried doubt. "Mamas. The question is whether he can fight through the pain long enough to finish this." The answer came moments later when Wallace launched a devastating attack aimed at Alan's injured side. The English knight managed to parry the blow, but the impact sent visible shockwaves through his body. Julie could see him struggling to maintain his grip on his sword, his immortal nature apparently not enough to completely overcome the accumulated damage of the fight. Wallace pressed his advantage, raining blow after blow on Alan's weakened defenses. The sound of steel on steel echoed through the courtyard like a blacksmith's hammer, each impact bringing the Scottish champion closer to victory. Julie found herself gripping Megan's weakened hand, both women united in their desperate hope that somehow Alan would find a way to survive. And then, just when it seemed that Wallace's victory was inevitable, Alan made his move. Instead of trying to block the next attack, he dropped to one knee and thrust upward with his sword, the blade sliding between the plates of Wallace's chest armor to pierce his heart. The Scottish champion stood motionless for a moment, his eyes wide with surprise. Then his great sword fell from nerveless fingers, and he collapsed to the stone courtyard with a sound like falling timber. The silence that followed was absolute. Hundreds of Scottish warriors stared at their fallen leader, unable to believe that the man who had seemed invincible was now lying motionless on the cold stone. Alan struggled to his feet, his sword still dripping with Wallace's blood, and faced the assembled army with the bearing of a true champion. "The combat is ended," he declared, his voice carrying clearly despite his obvious exhaustion. "By the laws of honor and the terms agreed upon, I claim victory. The siege is lifted, and the Scottish army will withdraw from English soil." For a moment, Julie thought the Scottish warriors might refuse to honor the agreement. The death of their beloved leader had clearly shaken them, and she could see anger and grief warring with respect for the ancient traditions of single combat. But then an older Scottish knight stepped forward and bowed deeply to Alan. "The victory is yours, Sir Alan Bennett," he said formally. "We will honor the terms of combat and withdraw as agreed. You have won not just this battle, but the respect of every warrior present." The Scottish army began to withdraw immediately, their departure as organized and efficient as their arrival had been. Within hours, the courtyard was empty, except for the bodies of the fallen and the handful of English defenders who had survived the siege. Julie rushed down from the keep as soon as it was safe, her heart pounding with relief and residual fear. She found Alan sitting on the steps of the Great Hall, his armor removed and his wounded arm being tended by Janet Reyes. He looked up as she approached, and she saw in his pale eyes a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over," he confirmed, wincing as Janet cleaned the wound on his shoulder. "The siege is lifted and we're safe." Julie wanted to throw her arms around him, to express her relief and gratitude in the most direct way possible. But she was acutely aware of the other people present, and the need to maintain proper decorum even in the aftermath of their salvation. "You saved us all," she said instead. Alan shook his head slowly. "I did what duty required, nothing more, nothing less." But Julie could see in his eyes that something fundamental had changed. The battle with Wallace had pushed him to his very limits, forcing him to confront the reality that even immortal knights were not truly invincible. The experience had marked him in ways that went beyond the physical wounds he had sustained. "Rest now," she said gently. "There will be time to talk later, when you've recovered your strength." Alan nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on her face. "Julie," he said quietly, "there are things we need to discuss, things that this battle has made clear to me." "What kind of things?" "The kind that might change everything between us," he replied, his voice carrying a weight of meaning that made her pulse quicken with both hope and apprehension. 3 days after the siege ended, Alan found Julie in the castle's herb garden, tending to the plants that had somehow survived the winter's harsh weather and the chaos of battle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carefully maintained beds, and the air carried the first hint of spring's eventual arrival. "Your shoulder is healing well," Julie observed as he approached, noting that he no longer favored his left arm. "The advantages of an immortal constitution," Alan replied, settling onto a stone bench beside the garden's central fountain. "Physical wounds heal quickly, even if other kinds of damage prove more persistent." Julie set down her gardening tools and moved to sit beside him, maintaining the careful distance they had observed since the siege ended. "What other kinds of damage?" Alan was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on some point beyond the garden walls. "The battle with Wallace forced me to confront certain truths about my existence that I had been avoiding for centuries." "What truths?" "That immortality is not the same as invincibility," he said slowly. "That even divine oaths have limits. That the price of absolute duty might be higher than any reasonable person should be expected to pay." Julie felt her heart begin to race, sensing that they were approaching the conversation that had been building between them for months. "What are you saying, Alan?" He turned to look at her directly, and she saw in his eyes a vulnerability that took her breath away. "I'm saying that I have spent 8 centuries believing that my oath to remain celibate and alone was the only way to honor Amar's memory and atone for my failure to protect her. But watching you during the siege, Seeing your courage and compassion in the face of mortal danger has made me question whether such absolute sacrifice truly serves any noble purpose. And what conclusion have you reached? That love is not a distraction from duty, but rather the very thing that gives duty meaning, Alan said, his voice gaining strength with each word. That protecting those we care about is not a weakness, but the highest calling any warrior can embrace. Julie felt tears prick at her eyes as the implications of his words sank in. Are you saying that you want to break your oath? I'm saying that I want to choose life over mere existence, Alan replied, reaching out to take her hand in his. I want to choose love over loneliness, hope over despair, the future over the past. The touch of his skin against hers sent electricity through Julie's entire body. This was the first time he had willingly made such contact since that night in the kitchen, and the significance of the gesture was not lost on either of them. But what about the consequences, she asked. What happens to an immortal knight who breaks a divine oath? Alan smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, the expression was entirely free of shadows. I suppose we'll discover that together, but whatever the cost might be, I no longer believe it could be higher than the price of spending eternity alone. Julie studied his face, seeing in it a resolution that had been building through months of internal struggle. You're certain about this? There's no going back once you make this choice. I have never been more certain of anything in 8 centuries of existence, Alan replied, bringing her hand to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. The question is whether you're willing to take such a risk with me. I don't know what I am or what I might become if I break my oath. I can't promise you a normal life or a predictable future. I don't want normal or predictable, Julie said firmly. I want you, Alan Bennett. Whatever you are, whatever you become, I want to face it together. Alan's composure finally cracked completely, and Julie saw in his expression centuries of loneliness and longing, finally given permission to surface. He cupped her face in his hands with infinite tenderness, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. Then God help us both, he whispered, because I am about to break the most sacred vow I have ever made. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, as though both were afraid that too much passion might somehow undo the miracle of their connection. But as their lips met and held, Julie felt something shift in the very fabric of reality around them. The air seemed to shimmer with an energy that had nothing to do with the physical world, and she could have sworn she heard the distant sound of chains breaking. When they finally separated, Alan's eyes were wide with wonder and something that might have been fear. I can feel it, he said quietly. The oath is dissolving, like ice melting in sunlight. Are you all right? Julie asked, concerned by the expression on his face. I don't know, he admitted honestly. I feel different, lighter somehow, but also more vulnerable, as though I've been carrying a great weight for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. Julie took his hands in hers, noting that his skin felt warmer than before, more human. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Alan nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. I love you, Julie Roberts. I have loved you since that first night in the chapel, when you looked at me and saw not a legend or a curse, but simply a man in need of understanding. And I love you, she replied, the words feeling like a prayer. I love your strength and your gentleness. You have your honor and your vulnerability. I love the way you've protected this castle and everyone in it, and I love the way you've let me see past your defenses to the man beneath. They sat together in the garden as the sun set behind the castle walls, holding each other close and marveling at the simple miracle of human connection. Julie could feel Alan's heartbeat against her cheek, steady and strong and reassuringly mortal. Whatever divine forces had sustained him through 8 centuries of immortal existence seemed to be giving way to something more fundamental and more precious. What happens now? She asked. Now we discover what it means to build a life together, Alan replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. We learn whether an immortal knight can find happiness as a mortal man, and whether love truly is stronger than the bonds of duty and obligation. And if it isn't, then we'll have had this moment, Alan said simply. This perfect, impossible moment when 2 lonely souls found each other across the centuries and chose to be brave enough to love. Julie smiled against his chest, feeling a peace she had never known settle into her bones. I think that might be enough. More than enough, Alan agreed. It's everything. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above Raven's Hollow Castle, Sir Alan Bennett and Julie Roberts sat together in the herb garden and began to write the first chapter of a love story that would prove stronger than divine oaths, more enduring than immortal curses, and more precious than all the legends that would be told about them in the centuries to come. The knight who had not known a woman's touch since the Crusades had finally found his way home, not to a place but to a person who saw him not as a legend, but as a man worthy of love. And in choosing that love, he had discovered that true immortality lay not in endless existence, but in the courage to live each moment fully in the company of someone who mattered more than duty, more than honor, and more than the weight of 8 centuries of solitude. Their story was just beginning, but it was already perfect in its simple truth, that love, when it finally comes, is always worth the wait, no matter how long that wait might be.